Good evening. Welcome to Thursday Night Bible Study. I'm Pastor David here at Forest Chapel Church, and we are going into our study of the New Testament tonight and looking at the book of Matthew. As a way of introduction and also a little bit of review, the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are often called the Synoptic Gospels. And synoptic means to have a general or collective view, or simply meaning things that are similar in content. The book of John is separated from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, both in terms of time and of character. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written in the middle part of the first century, within about 20 years of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. John was written when John was very old, likely around the year 80 AD. John lived to a very old age, and he was on the island of Patmos when he passed away, and he was quite old at the time. John is believed to have been the youngest of the disciples, and so lived longer. He's also the only one of the disciples who did not face a martyr's death. So he wrote later on in his life. Matthew, Mark, and Luke present the outer, the human, the public aspects of the life of Jesus. John reveals the inner, the divine, the private parts of the life of Jesus. Now, Matthew, as we mentioned in our preview of the New Testament last week, presents Jesus as the king, as the son of David, a descendant of Abraham and Solomon and Joseph. Now, a little bit about Matthew. Matthew is the author, he is the writer of the book. Matthew was a publican. A publican was a Jew who had become a tax collector for the hated Romans. And so, that being the case, they were often classified by the Jews, especially by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as being with the sinners. Publicans were assumed to be on a low moral level, and they were basically looked upon as traitors to the people of Israel. Matthew is also known as Levi. Matthew becomes a disciple of Jesus, chapter 9, verse 9, and then he is appointed as an apostle, meaning to go out, one who is going to go out and to share the message. Now, the central message of Matthew is that it might be fulfilled. And that phrase is stated at least 12 times in the book of Matthew. Matthew is presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Matthew's purpose is trying to prove to Jewish readers that Jesus is the promised Messiah or the promised King. When you look at the structure of the book of Matthew, Matthew is a pretty organized book as far as the material he covers, the placement of the material, the chronological sequence of the material. There is an introduction, and that is chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 11. And within the introduction of Matthew is a genealogy, is the birth of Jesus, Jesus' baptism, and the temptation of Jesus. Now, why the genealogy to begin with? Well, you have to remember that Matthew is writing primarily to the Hebrew people. He's writing for the Jews. And of course, the Jews, according to their scripture, the Old Testament, they believed that their Messiah was going to come through a certain family, through the family, the line of David. And Matthew shows the line of Jesus that goes directly back to Abraham, the father of the Hebrew nation, and the lineage of Jesus is traced. Matthew records the birth of Jesus and the events surrounding his coming. And many of the events that happened around the birth of Jesus were fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. Let's look at them. We'll start with a passage from Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and give birth to a son and will call him Jesus. And then let's turn to Matthew chapter 1, verses 22 to 23. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Jesus, which means God with us, or Emmanuel, which means God with us. And let's go to Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. In Matthew 2, verse 23. And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophet, he will be called a Nazarene. And Jeremiah 31, verse 15. This is the prophecy. This is what the Lord says. A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because her children are no more. And in Matthew 2, 17 and 18. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And of course, that was the result of King Herod's killing so many young babies, trying to find this Jesus born to be king of the Jews, trying to find this baby and take care of this baby. Now let's look at Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Hosea 11, verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And Matthew 2:15. Or we'll do 14 and 15. So he got up, took the child and his mother, and this is speaking of Joseph, during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. The fulfillment. Micah 5, verse 2. Finding Micah chapter 5 and verse. So in Micah, we read, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. In Matthew 2, verses 5 and 6, the fulfillment of that prophecy. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people, Israel. So that is the birth of Jesus. Those are some of the prophecies, and Matthew shows these people. Remember, again, he's writing to the people of Israel, to the Hebrew people, to prove that Jesus is their promised Messiah. Here he is. He is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. Now, immediately after the baptism of Jesus, Jesus is tempted by Satan in the wilderness. And we have that in chapter 4 of Matthew. It's important for us to realize that Jesus was tempted as a man. He was tempted in all the ways that we are. He was tempted physically. Command these stones to be made bread. He's been in the desert for 40 days without food. And Satan is tempting him, saying to him, you've got the power. Command these stones to become bread and then eat. And then towards the soul, Satan tempts Jesus to cast himself down. Show your pride, show how strong and powerful you are to everyone. And he's appealing to the pride, to the soul. And then appeals to the spirit of Jesus when Satan says, fall down and worship me. And that's Satan's technique, not only with Jesus, but also with us as well. To attack us physically, to attack us mentally, to attack us spiritually. Now I'm going to pull up a map. When Jesus was baptized, now if we go up here, here's Nazareth, here's where Jesus was from, and Jesus is baptized in the Jordan, just north of the Dead Sea. There's Jerusalem. So he is in this area when John the Baptist baptizes him. Likely Jesus had heard of John the Baptist and that he was baptizing, and that's why Jesus had made his way and why we find him early on here. And the baptism area is believed to have been a few miles north of the Dead Sea here. And then when Jesus goes into the wilderness, that would be this area out here. You can see there aren't any city names out here. This is a very rugged and wilderness type of area. Now, when we speak of wilderness in good old Augusta County, we're generally talking about a wilderness of trees, and it's forested, and that's about it. Just many trees. But the wilderness in Jesus' time and in the area of Palestine means an area that is basically like desert, but it's hilly, it's rocky, it's mountainous with very little vegetation. And that would be the kind of wilderness that Jesus was in, a hot type of wilderness. And so that's where we find Jesus at the end of his temptation. Now, if we look at Matthew chapter 4, verse 12, Matthew tells us, when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he returned to Galilee. So Jesus is now making this trek from the Judea area, back up to Galilee. John has been put in prison here in Jerusalem. And perhaps it was that Jesus, he knew he wanted to call his disciples, and that was going to take place in both places as he was leaving Judea. And of course, mainly most of the disciples were from the area of Galilee. Likely, Jesus saw John being put in prison as perhaps a threat. Jesus knew what his timeline was. Jesus had everything planned out. And so he is likely thinking, I'm not ready for the cross yet. I have ministry to do. And so he's heading up to the Galilee area. and is kind of out of the sights of King Herod. So he goes to the area of Galilee. And then we see his ministry. Matthew shares his ministry there in Galilee. And in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, we have the teachings of Jesus. We know these as the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount, believed to have taken place here just outside the Sea of Galilee, up on a hilltop near the sea. And that is where the Sermon on the Mount would have taken place. Teaching points that Jesus covers in the Sermon on the Mount. In chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 18, Jesus talks about virtues, he talks about morals, he talks about motives. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, and to the end, to the rest of chapter 6, he's dealing with material things. He's dealing with things that are social. Then Matthew chapter 7, which is the last chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew records Jesus giving encouragement. Jesus summarizes what he has said, and Jesus gives the people some exhortation to follow these words, these teachings that he has taught, Matthew 5 and 6. And in chapter 7, Jesus is encouraging them to follow these words of mine. Do these words of mine. Don't just hear them, but do them. The Sermon on the Mount is the kingdom of Jesus. 14 times in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, I say unto you. He deals with the law of Moses. Now, these verses contain an incredible amount of material for living practically today. There could be a sermon on each one of these parables and each one of these teachings. In chapter 7, as Jesus is summarizing, we see that there are Jesus speaks of two. Now, I know our culture today has seems to have a real problem with being limited to two, but Jesus was quite clear in his teachings throughout the scriptures that there are two ways. There's heaven, there's hell. But let's look at what Jesus mentions here. Chapter 7, verse 13. There are two gates. Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. And verse 14, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Two ways, two gates, two destinations. Verse 21 through verse 23 of chapter 7. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does. Here's where Jesus is summarizing. He who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Two destinations. And there are two foundations. Jesus tells a very short parable to make his point about the words that he has been teaching and about the foundations. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, and here we go, who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Two foundations, and only two. In Jesus' ministry in Galilee, there are recorded his works, his healings, his miracles. In these three chapters, there are 10 miracles that take place. Matthew chapter 8. And this is continuing his ministry in Galilee. Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. When he came down from the mountain, that is from where he taught the Sermon on the Mount, when he came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand, touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cured of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Even when Jesus was doing the healings, he was still asking the people to follow the teachings of Moses. Matthew chapter 8. Verse 5, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering. Jesus said to him, I will go and heal him. The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was astonished, and he said to those following him, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, it will be done, just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that very hour. Matthew 8, chapter 14 and 15. Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. Staying in chapter 8, verses 28 through 34. When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, two demon-possessed men were coming from the tombs and met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. What do you want with us, Son of God? They shouted. Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time? At some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, if you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs. He said to them, go. So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. In between those healings was Jesus calming the storm. Moving to chapter 9, Jesus heals a paralytic. Let's look at verses 18 through 22. While he was saying this, a ruler came and knelt before him and said, my daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live. Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, if I only touch his cloak, I will be healed. Jesus turned and saw her. Take heart, daughter, he said. Your faith has healed you. And the woman was healed from that moment. When Jesus entered the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd, he said, go away. The girl is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in, took the girl by the hand, and she got up. News of this spread through all of that region. 27. We're still in chapter 9, verse 27 through 31. Jesus went on from there. 2 blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him, and he asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They replied, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, will it be done to you?" And their sight was restored. Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." But they went out and spread the news about him all over that region. And then as they're going out, there was a demon-possessed man who could not talk, and he was brought to Jesus. And when Jesus drove the demon out of the man was able to speak. These 10 miracles are mentioned in detail. But in Matthew chapter 15, but in verse 35, Matthew says that Jesus went about healing every sickness and disease. So what we have here is just a small part of the number of healings and miracles that Jesus did. And that is referred to by the other writers of the Gospels as well. I believe it's Luke or John that actually finishes up their gospel by saying there are many other things which Jesus did in his ministry, so many that would fill up many books. But these are particular ones that Matthew remembered, that Matthew saw as very revealing of the ministry of Jesus, and so shared these. In chapter 10, Jesus chooses the 12 who are going to be his witnesses after he is returned to the Father. And then they, in turn, are expected to train others. Matthew records more of the instructions of Jesus to the 12 than the other Gospels. The Jews were to hear the gospel first, and then the Gentiles. And that does become, in the book of Acts, the process of how that happens. Chapters 11 through 18, we see a lot of the reactions of the people to the ministry of Jesus. In Matthew, the word kingdom is used 55 times. Now, remember, again, who Matthew's target audience is. And that they are the Jews. Matthew is declaring to them that Jesus is their king, the Messiah king, and he's declaring to them the coming of his kingdom. So this Jesus is your Messiah king, and here is about his kingdom as well. And the Jews knew the word kingdom very well, all the way back in the Old Testament, book of Exodus 19, verse 6, when they are at the foot of Mount Sinai. And God says to the people, "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, the holy nation." And the prophets over and over again spoke of the kingdom. Now, after the miracles and the teachings of Jesus regarding the kingdom, we see that there were results that happened in his ministry there in Galilee. Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 and 5. John had heard, all the way down in Jerusalem in prison, John had heard of the ministry of Jesus. And so John is wondering if Jesus truly is the one to come. Perhaps being in prison, John has a few doubts. He was the one that had baptized Jesus. He knew Jesus was to be the chosen one, but perhaps he's having a tough time now with the way the situation is. But he sends his disciples to talk to Jesus, to ask Jesus some questions. What he has his disciples ask is, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? Jesus replies, go back and report to John what you see and hear. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. So Jesus was telling John, yeah, I am. I am the one. In chapter 11, there are cities that are unrepentant, despite the miracles that Jesus did in them, despite the healings that Jesus did. There are cities that are unrepentant. There are Pharisees that encounter Jesus, and they are unreasonable with Jesus. Moving into chapter 12, verse 10. Going on from that place, and I'm going to start at verse 9. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, they, meaning the Pharisees, asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So they're trying to trap him. They're trying to make Jesus say he's doing something that is according to the law of Moses, or according to their reading of the law of Moses, to do something that is wrong. Verse 14. And before I read verse 14, Jesus' response, the Pharisees don't have an answer for. Jesus says to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, won't you take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And that's what Jesus said to the Pharisees. And Jesus did this so often to the Pharisees, and it frustrated them. What were they going to say? They had nothing they could say. Jesus would leave them speechless. And then that brings us to verse 14. Jesus, in verse 13, Jesus heals the man's hand. The Pharisees, then in verse 14, but the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus, how they might kill him. Verse 24. But when the Pharisees heard this, Jesus had done another healing. But when the Pharisees heard this, they said, it is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons. He can't be one of us. And so their natural point of defense is to say, oh, he's doing it because he's serving the devil. That's where he gets his power. There were unbelieving multitudes of people. 13, verses 13 through 15. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and in turn, I would heal them. And then there were the scribes who were stuck in tradition. Verse 15. Chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. So they are so stuck on their traditions. They're worried about tradition and washing hands. And so they have to pick something apart. And so that's what they're picking at with Jesus and with his disciples. And then in chapter 16 of Matthew, we have the Pharisees and the Sadducees demanding of Jesus some proof. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. So they want to test him. He's been doing these signs for all of his ministry. He's been healing, raising people from the dead, calming storms. He's been doing all of these things, and yet they still want a sign from heaven. They want Jesus really to test God by performing this sign. In the 13th chapter, we have the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. In Matthew chapter 16, verses 17 and 18, Jesus and his disciples go to Caesarea Philippi after they've been rejected in the area of Galilee. Matthew 16, 17 and 18. Jesus replied, so they go on to the area of Caesarea Philippi. Let's take a look just to so we understand where we're talking about now. Here's a map. So they've been in Galilee, Sea of Galilee, the whole area around there. That's where Jesus is preaching and teaching. And then over here is Caesarea, called Caesarea Philippi. And so they come over here after being rejected there in Galilee. And here, when they're in Caesarea Philippi, this is where Jesus talks about the church and what the church is going to be about. And from Caesarea Philippi, then Jesus begins his route to Jerusalem. And this is his final journey. And he knows exactly what's coming up when he's headed to Jerusalem. Chapters 19 and 20 tell about the journey of Jesus from Caesarea to Jerusalem, the incidents, the happenings along the way as he's traveling. Jesus knew what the outcome was going to be. Matthew chapter 20, verses 17 through 19. Now, as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside and said to them, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will turn him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he will be raised to life." In verse 28, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus makes it quite clear, or it seems to us anyway. It wasn't as clear to the disciples, who apparently just thought, yes, Jesus has to say these things and let it slide by. But Jesus is very clearly letting them know that not only is he going to suffer, but he's going to be raised. Matthew chapter 1, very familiar. This is the triumphal entry that is described, and what we call Palm Sunday, the events there, verses 1 through 17. Jesus is offering himself as the Messiah King, and here is where he fulfills the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, which speaks of the king coming and riding upon the donkey. And Jesus fulfills that as he rides into the city. In Matthew chapter 1, there is conflict As Jesus ministers in Jerusalem, he goes into the temple. He clears the temple because of all the money changers that are there when it's supposed to be a place of worship. And there are other encounters that he has with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Earlier, here Jesus also pronounces 8 woes. WOE, 8 woes or sadnesses that are going to come upon Jerusalem. And those do come to pass. They do take place within a few years after Jesus' death and resurrection. In chapters 24 and 25, we have what's called the Olivet Discourse. And Jesus is here in the garden. He's speaking with his disciples about the end times. And this is certain, sure and certain prophecy spoken of by the number one prophet. We need to note that every time Jesus spoke to his disciples about his crucifixion, he always included his resurrection in that talk. Matthew 17, verses 22 and 23. When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. That's one place. Matthew 26, verses 28 to 32. "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you the truth, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Whenever he spoke of the crucifixion, he also spoke of his resurrection. Chapters 26 and 27 deal with the events of the crucifixion of Jesus. We see in Matthew chapter 26, Jesus draw together with his disciples. He gathers them. They gather together in the garden, and he's teaching them. He's preparing them. They gather together in the upper room. Jesus foresaw everything that was going to come to pass. Chapter 26, verse 12, when he has the disciples gathered together, and the woman comes in and pours the ointment on Jesus' feet and head. Here's what Jesus said: "When she poured the perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial." So Jesus knew what was coming and spoke of it. At the supper, chapter 26 and verse 25, Jesus speaks of what Judas is getting ready to do. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "Yes, it is you." And in verse 28, Jesus speaks of the blood, his blood, which is going to be spilled, being the blood of the new covenant. So Jesus could foresee everything that was going to happen. So the first thing is the first major event of the crucifixion is Jesus drawing his disciples together, sharing with them from his heart, his teachings, his love, preparing them. The second thing that happens, after Jesus is arrested, he goes before the governing body of the Sanhedrin. And we've talked about the Sanhedrin. Matthew chapter 26, verses 57 through 75 talk of Matthew shares the events and what happened as Jesus was there before that council. They make accusations of him. They bring in false witnesses, and yet Jesus remains silent. He is then charged with blasphemy, and he is sentenced to die. Chapter 26 and verse 66. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy." And verse 67. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. So Jesus is then sentenced to death. Now he has to go before the Roman governor. The Jewish authorities, the Sanhedrin, even though they had great clout and great power within the Hebrew people, within the Jewish people, they could not carry out themselves a crucifixion or capital punishment. They could not carry out. By the Roman law, they could govern their people. But when it came to something like that, the Roman governor had to approve that and make that happen. So he goes before the Roman governor, who is Pontius Pilate. Matthew chapter 27 has the back and forth that happens. And then there's the crucifixion. And at the end of Matthew 26, or at the end of Matthew 27, you see the crucifixion. Matthew describes the crucifixion and specifically the events that happen around the crucifixion more vividly than Mark or Luke or John. Matthew speaks of the miraculous things that happened around the death of Jesus. There's a darkness at midday. There is an earthquake. There's a cleaving of rocks. Graves are disturbed. There's a tearing of the veil of the temple that tore from top to bottom. What is the significance of that? The veil was the curtain that separated the people from the presence of God in the temple. Only the priest could go to God behind that veil. If you were a Jewish person, the only way you could speak with God was through that priest. The significance is that with the death of Jesus, the way has been opened up to believers to go straight to God. I don't have to go to a priest to take confession. I can speak directly with God in prayer. So that's the significance of that curtain being torn. Chapter 28 deals with the resurrection. There's only 20 verses in this chapter, but it is the great mountaintop of all that we believe in our faith. And Matthew doesn't go into any theological debate about the fact. He just shares, these are the facts, just the facts, ma'am. These are the facts that he shares. Verses 1 through 7 of chapter 28, the angel announces the resurrection of Jesus. Verses 8 through 10, this is where Jesus is seen. Verses 11 through 15, the Jewish authorities have nothing left to do except lie about it because he's gone and he's risen. In chapters 16 through 20, Jesus leaves the Great Commission to those 11 disciples and to us. Now, a couple other things that are important to remember in Matthew that might bear further study. One is parables. Jesus spoke in many parables. Matthew has many of the parables. He tells the reason why he uses parables in Matthew 13, verses 10 through 11. The disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" He replied, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. So parables and parables deserve perhaps further reading on those and study. They're a good subject. Peter and the church, Matthew chapter 16. We have to have a good understanding of the interaction that takes place here and the way this is translated. The church was and is not built on Simon Peter. Simon Peter doesn't guard the pearly gates. Jesus will build his church, is building our church, and Jesus is the rock of our salvation. Matthew chapter 24 and 25, what is called the Olivet Discourse. And this is when Jesus has the disciples together in the garden on Mount Olivet. And there are prophecies that Jesus shares. And these are the last days prophecies of Jesus, his account of the end time. So that's another section that deserves some extra study, maybe taking a look at and reading in light of some of the other end times writings that are in the Bible. And then there are the 7 last words of Jesus on the cross. We often hear about these when we are in the season of Lent, Good Friday. The 7 last words of the cross, a lot of people think that they are all in one gospel in order, but they aren't. I'm going to give you the 7 last words of Jesus as Bible scholars believe they were spoken. And that's based upon events that were going on around the cross. And we start in Luke chapter 23, verse 34. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And verse 43, Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise." John chapter 19, verse 26. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Dear woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. And then Matthew 27:46, the next words from the cross. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then back to John 19, verse 28. Later, knowing that all was now completed, and so that the scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." And verse 30, when he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And Luke 23, verse 46, the last words of Jesus from the cross. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. So what do you remember about Matthew? Matthew presents Jesus as the blank, the Messiah King. Second question, what are the first 3 Gospels called? the synoptic gospels. And of course, meaning that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all very similar in content and to the time period in which they were wrote. John, still roughly the same content, but not shared in quite the same way. What is the great theme of Matthew? That's your third question. What is the great theme of Matthew? That it might be fulfilled. Again, remembering who Matthew is writing to and how he is trying to convince them. So he uses the Old Testament scriptures and prophecies and then compares them to how they are fulfilled in the life of Jesus, so that it might be fulfilled. Question number 4. Why did Matthew give one genealogy and Luke, excuse me, and Luke give another? Well, Matthew gave Jesus' legal descent. And again, speaking to the point of Matthew writing to the Hebrew people, to the Jewish people, showing the legal descent of Jesus, because the Hebrew people knew that the Messiah was to come through the line of Abraham, was to come through the line of David. And so Matthew shows that in his genealogy, the legal genealogy, which in those days had to come through the Father. Luke shares a descent through Mary. And question number 5, Matthew presents the ministry of Jesus in 2 different regions in Palestine. What are they called? The area around Jesus' hometown, the northern area around the Sea of Galilee. So you could say the region of Galilee. And the other one is the region, southern region down near the Dead Sea, the region of Jerusalem and Judea. Well, I sure appreciate you joining us for Bible study tonight. And I hope that you have found something inspiring to learn about Jesus in the writings of Matthew. Next week, we'll be looking at Mark. So you might go ahead and read that. Mark's a shorter book, so should be able to read all of the chapters between now and next week for that study. As always, encourage you, be in church on Sunday morning. If you do not have a church home, if you're looking for a church home, of course, I invite you to join us at Forest Chapel if you're local. And we are right in downtown Cremora. We're right across the road from Sammy's Station at the intersection of Route 612 and 340. Well, have a blessed rest of the week.